Welcome to this session given by Bruce Lerner, and as explained in introductory session, I'm going to pass it straight over to Bruce. Over to you, Bruce.
Training course is best for you. I am Bruce Lerner. Let me start by dashing your hopes. The answer to this question is based on personal needs, so there will not be a single answer. We will work through a systems thinking method so that you can select a course that meets your needs. Setting a personal baseline. To begin, you should have a personal sense of what systems thinking is. That sense may be consistent with others or different, but it provides a baseline to test our understanding and adjust that understanding as appropriate. As Joe indicated in the introduction to this summit, there are a number of definitions, so we must take a stand and select or make our own. My working baseline is systems thinking is one of a set of tools for making sense of the world. Making sense of the world is clarifying our perspective of the phenomena around us. This perspective leads to an approach. The tools provided are methods, processes, and techniques, and of course, literal tools. So what's the plan? I'm going to cover this topic in 3 sections. First, I'll provide some history so we have a basis for the information we need in a systems thinking course. Second, I'll discuss the decision-making process in the context of systems thinking. Then we'll go through the selecting a course example to demonstrate the process and provide you a pattern for course selection. For someone interested in systems thinking training, some historical perspective is in order. Let's work backwards a bit. How is system thinking described by some of its luminaries? Michael Jackson, in 2003, discusses systems thinking as hard and soft. The first addresses mathematical techniques, and the second considers perspectives and worldviews. Jay Forrester in 1992 took a look around and said that systems thinking has no clear definition or usage. Peter Cheklin in 1981 suggests that systems thinking and analytic thinking will come to be thought of as the twin components of scientific thinking. Russell Ackoff in 1979 describes systems thinking. 3 steps are involved in this process. First, a thing to be understood is conceptualized as a part of one or more larger wholes, not as a whole to be taken apart. Then, understanding of the larger containing systems is sought. Finally, the system to be understood is explained in terms of its roles or functions in the containing system. From this sampling, we see that there is a scientific and a philosophic aspect to systems thinking, mathematics and perspective, parts of a larger whole. This draws us to general systems theory, which was developed to supplement the prevailing human method of reductionism, taking things apart to see how they work. For all of this detail, one of the most important takeaways is the small slice of history in which systems thinking has existed. The basis for general systems thinking was developed in the 1920s in regard to biological systems by Ludwig von Bertalanffy. He recognized broader applicability to social and other systems through the 1930s and 40s and published GST in English in 1950. There are a number of retrospectives captured in the 1980s and 1990s expressing the history of GST and the use of the term systems thinking. The lecture by Ackoff from 1993, shown in the references, is a broad-ranging view of people's perception of reality and the attempt to make sense of it. It is definitely worth a look. He presents the observation that human nature includes taking things apart to see what makes them tick, even from a young age. This reductionist thinking sufficed until the late second millennium, when there was a paradigm shift in the understanding of the world. The recognition that the behavior of a system was not discernible by simply looking at its separated components led to the thought that the interactions between the components were the major influence on systems behavior. I mentioned work in adjacent fields and want to provide some touch points. In the mid-1930s through World War II, modern operations research grew out of scientific management. In the 1940s, the term systems engineering was used and the techniques began to be formalized. In 1948, Norbert Wiener introduced cybernetics, the science of control and communications. In the mid-1950s, Jay Forrester developed systems dynamics, a method to frame, evaluate, and communicate complex issues using mathematical modeling and simulation. In the 1970s, Stafford Beer's application of cybernetics to management yielded the viable systems model and management cybernetics. All these fields claim to use or own systems thinking. This overview provides some reference to the people, the timeframes, and the adjacent endeavors that are associated with systems thinking in areas that you might need to investigate to study systems thinking. With this as a base, let us start looking specifically at selecting a course on systems thinking. Obviously, the history of systems thinking is a topic that we want to make sure that it's covered. Is reductionism versus holism the big issue for systems thinking? What tools are used in system thinking? And this is actually a pretty long list, but I think I can summarize it this way. Is systems thinking really everywhere? I'm involved in some group forums related to systems engineering and find that the questions of where do I start, where am I going, and how do I get there are raised by new practitioners all the time. It is likely that students in systems thinking have very similar questions. I expect that some of you have experience that could extend this list, and that this list would actually be helpful to students of the X Systems X area. Getting back on track, we want to discuss systems thinking courses. As I mentioned earlier, there is not one answer to this question because the answer is based on your specific needs. I've selected some typical courses and goals for the example, and we can discuss specific details in the Q&A. I generally prefer working through the needs evaluation before working on alternatives, but I'm going to start with describing some alternatives because they provide insight into the selection criteria. Here are 3 alternatives I found with a web search. There is an example of a short course, in this case 2 hours, an example of a college term course, which is often 1/4, and a self-paced guided session without hard time constraints. So the short course format often takes 1 to 5 days. They are compact, minimal amount of time they take off of work, so it does not impact that working schedule. However, it really doesn't cover everything that might be needed in the way of knowledge. Can be the worst learning experience because it's very short term. You're rushed into working through things. There's no thinking time available, mostly lectures. There are a few exceptional stories that get brought in, little time for interaction between the participants. not necessarily any time to actually discuss specific problems. The time is highly driven by the instructor's schedule and the information that he needs to get through, and there's minimal opportunity to grow a personal network over that short period. The college term format has 2 to 3 hours of formal class time per week. It goes on for multiple weeks, so it does not strongly impact a daily individual schedule. There is enough time to introduce more material, and the expectation is that students will work on their own. The class time may be primarily lectures or a more participative format. There is still a constraint to move the whole class along concurrently, so becoming derailed can be fatal. The interactions over time can provide for a better networking experience. An extended cohort can exist for multiple semesters or a year, has an advantage, but there are some risks. Difficult topics can be given more time. Areas of interest can be pursued. Unfortunately, procrastination becomes really easy. Overall, learning happens in multiple formats that are a little different than the typical course. Learning happens by observation of styles and strategies of other students and intervention by the instructor. We now enter the second item in our plan, decision making. In this case, structured decision making. Charles Kepner and Benjamin Trago, working on operations research at the Rand Corporation in the mid-1950s, applied aspects of systems thinking to problem solving and validated their results against successful managers. The resulting systematic approach consisted of 3 rational processes. Problem analysis evaluates the current situation in relation to the desired situation. We need to specifically recognize what we expect and what we have. Decision analysis characterizes the gaps exposed in problem analysis and evaluates alternatives. Potential problem analysis evaluates the impact of our decision and proposes corrective actions. This is typically called risk analysis. And there is a situation appraisal step that provides techniques and tools for determining which of the 3 thinking processes should be applied. Applying the rational processes to selecting a systems thinking course. Situation analysis to establish why we want a systems thinking course. Problem analysis for uncovering what the gaps are between our actual and desired knowledge. Decision analysis for determining how to evaluate alternatives and to select one. And potential problem analysis to protect our decision. Here are some possible reasons we might want to take a systems thinking course along with their differentiating characteristics. I have summarized from the possible topics list and used only a few items from the course descriptions to make this example manageable. First, we might be interested in advancing our career. We need to be concerned about the topics we need to learn, when we need to learn them, and whether we will be assessed by our grades or our execution. Second, we might be personally interested in learning. Topics and timeframes are important here. We might be interested in learning to solve a specific problem, so timeframe and competence are important. If we just want to get better at what we do, competence is our focus. If we're interested in exploring, time frame and local activities could be factors. And last, for example, making contacts is important to build our network. Of course, there can be other reasons that may be more important to you. Instructor background, whether it's academic or industry, instructor years teaching this course duration, week or less, semester, community. Capture your additional criteria in this way. So what are our gaps? Analyzing the situation we just described indicates these differentiators. Topics lead to methods and techniques, tools, history, and application. These items can be quantified. For time frames, we can group some options. For grades, 2 options should work. With competence, levels of learning are useful and can be assigned a value. Specific location can work. Here are some of my ideas. For context, how we interact is important. To actually run an evaluation, we need to develop criteria, the measures, their relative importance, and scoring rubrics. If we don't have some choices, we don't actually have a decision, so alternatives are needed. And then we can evaluate the alternatives by comparing each alternative's responses to our criteria. For each of the criteria, I've set up a measure, a weight, and some idea of how we're going to score it. So for the measures, I have things here like an actual number. I have a Boolean existence. I have a ranking between these items. And then I've assigned specific weighting for which of these criteria are important or most important, etc. And then the details for the scoring. So for number of methods techniques, the measure is an actual number. The weighting is 5. It's very important to us. And it actually is just going to count the total number of methods techniques covered. For tools, we're going to take a look at the number of tools. Again, it's a count. It's only going to count as 3, so it's about half as important as the number of methods, and it's another total count. History covers is just going to say, are they going to talk about history or not? So it's a Boolean, and it's just true or false. The number of applications that are covered is also just a count, and its weight is 2 here. Time frame for availability, I'm assuming we need the course as soon as possible. So the order that we have this in is that it's available now, it gets a good score. If it's available within a year, it gets about half that. And if it's just sometime in the future, it gets a score of 1. The grade is ranked, and it's either we can excel at it, we can pass it, or we may just not want to take this one at all because it's too difficult. For level of competence we're looking for, it's very important to us. We want to understand it gives us a 1, applying it is 3, being able to analyze, it's a 5, evaluating gives us a 7, and if we can actually go forward and create things from what we've learned here, then it's going to give us a 10. Location activity, again, we get to make this up as to what's important to us, and we can move these numbers around. It's ranked, it's relatively low weight, but if we're looking at history of the place, it gets a 1. If we are looking for nightlife, it gets a 5 in this case. If we can go out and see nature in the area, it gets a 3. Architecture gets a 2, and museums get a 5. So we have basically something important to do off hours and something to do in the evenings. And then the contact opportunity that is offered by this course is moderately important. It's best if it's in person. It's good if it's got virtual cohort, and it's least interactive if we have discussion groups. Once we've developed the criteria, it can be captured in a useful format. Since we want to make this process visible, there is more information that can be provided to help others understand the intent of the decision so they can contribute, and we can remember what we were thinking about later. And we can indicate acceptable levels of compliance by capturing a threshold value, the criteria passes, and an objective value, this is what we'd really like to see. If you have any questions, remember to put them up in the chat. For alternatives, I searched around up on the internet and found these three alternatives that gives us a little bit of variance in the way courses are taught. There's a 2-hour course shown on the left, a 1/4 course in the middle, and a self-paced guided session that can last for up to a year on the right-hand side. Here is an example evaluation using these alternatives. I've guessed at the course responses to our criteria based on their websites. A more thorough investigation might be required. As an example of how this thought process works, a 2-hour course is not going to get beyond exposure to some of our criteria, so competence development is low. A year-long course offers more. We see that the location ends up the same for all three, so it turns out not to be a differentiator. Again, we can go over this with questions if you have them. Now we can compare the captured information by visualizing our results. Here in a spider diagram, the orange line bounds our threshold conditions. As you can see, none of our alternatives meet all of our thresholds. The more area covered shows a stronger alternative, making the USCD the weakest candidate in this case. Here's another view. We can use pairwise comparisons to assess specific advantages and disadvantages. Here we see that Udemy has some advantages over the USCD course, but EverCourse is a clear winner based on our guesstimates. To round out the discussion of rational processes, here's an example of potential problem analysis or risk analysis. This provides an additional way to assess the robustness of our decision. Having selected the EverCourse, we can capture some potential issues and think about mitigating them. For this example, too few application examples are covered. This has a relatively high risk rating, probability times consequence, which generates a risk of 48. We can counter this by requesting additional examples, and the format provides the time for them to be supplied. And secondly, the available time frame is too long to hit the next promotion cycle. An even higher risk rating, but I can control the course pace by just working harder. And for this third one, if I find myself stuck, I can always get help by going to the cohort. Overall, I think you've recognized that this is a spreadsheet that I put together. It can be downloaded from the URL shown. In summary, I've sneakily introduced a systematic method to address decision-making for an undesired situation. In this case, not having sufficient formal training about systems thinking. The broader scope that this method encourages was driven by observing operations from a systems thinking perspective. The method is teachable and repeatable so one can get better at it, and it can also be collaborative. If you are interested in additional discussion after the summit, stop by the Oasis Cafe on Thursday nights at 7 p.m. East Coast USA time for a respite from the wilds of systems things to talk about systems things. And finally, here are some of the references that were used in pulling this information together. And thank you for sticking through to the end.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
I have a question. At the beginning, you talked about the topics. How would somebody know what they need to know?
Well, that is sort of why I walk through some of the background first, so that we would have the ability to use that as a talking point, if necessary, for this. It also gives people a place to go look for additional information.
So if I want to take a course on systems thinking, how would I know what topics the course has to cover?
You would take a look at the systems thinkers, and I guess the background line on it is that you would look for a course that covered information about those individuals. And depending on the level of course that you're looking to take, you can figure out how deeply you want to get involved. I mean, it's this sort of the same answer for any course or any question. So again, I'm not sure what else. I mean, I could give an answer, but I couldn't give an answer that was going to be viable for everyone.
Well, does anybody have an answer to that question? Unmute yourself and give me the answer. Pascal.
I don't have an answer. I have a question, so I'll come back for my question later.
Okay, if nobody answers my question, we'll deal with your question.
Well, I wrote my answer in the chat. How would I know that I would like to take a course?
How would you know you would like to take a course, and then how would you figure out what you need to learn?
That's the next step, but the first step is, not to know that I don't know.
Well, I mean, it could be as simple as
Think
what's
about the
happened
5
here.
stages of ignorance.
Well, one at a time, please.
I only have 5.
Oh, Bruce, I'm really disappointed. Isn't the first principle of visualize what you're doing? These are use cases. I have a vision of doing something, and then I work out what do I need to know to do it. And then I know what I need to know.
I think this is similar to the question you asked me previously, Joe, is that this is just a description of decision making. Well, this is just a question of how do I figure out that I need to learn something, right? So I mean,
It's a snowball search.
that's a good way too. You pick up a little bit, you pick up a little bit more,
and you start to recognize what the search terms should be, and so you start expanding the search based on the snowball.
Don't we do that every day?
Yep. A lot of people do it and they don't even realize that there's a name for it.
Exactly. We just do it.
sort of like systems thinking.
Yes. Another approach might be to pick up my dissertation, because my dissertation results in a framework of, after reading over 1,000 works and then coding them using grounded theory and then distilling them into a framework for what are the competences needed to be a systems engineer with the underlying background that requires being a systems thinker. And that would be one way to do it. That was part of what I did it for, was to develop that framework.
Exactly. When I'm mentoring people and in thinking about their careers, I again think about where do you want to be 3, 4, 5 years from now? What will you be doing? What will you need to know to do it? And then work back from there to now. And so you now have a list. So if system thinking is involved, you would now have a list of things you need to know. You'd need to know how to use it. Well, in order to know how to use it, you need to have to know what the options are, what the tools are. And is history important? Do you care?
I
Otherwise,
think that
we are doomed to repeat it.
Well, if you learn them, if you don't learn the mistakes from history, you'll repeat them. But so you don't have to learn the rest of history, you just have to learn the mistakes, right? But then,
Well,
unless you
good
actually
things
want to
were just
repeat something.
accidentally good.
but there was this discussion in the chat during the session about Bruce, you said that systems thinking seems to be a relatively modern way of thinking. And I've seen that in the systems thinking literature, but we addressed that in session 0. It's not, it's been in use for thousands of years. They just never called it systems thinking.
Well, that's essentially what I said in the chat in the background here, but I agree. But the time frame in which we have conceptualized that systems thinking is a thing that exists that we can address is small.
I'm not sure. I think people have been doing, we can split a community.
People have been dying from cancer for a long time, but it wasn't until the late 1880s that somebody put a name to it.
That's true. But we see, I think we can split the community into community of inquiry that's developing the tools and community of practice that is using the tools. And the community of practice that uses the tools may not even know what they're called, may not care what they're called. They've just been using them. And there's a feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
Community of practice uses the heuristics and works out and learns what works. The community of inquiry understands why it works. And that enables the community of practice to do some variations. And that generates more knowledge that the community of inquiry can link into their theories or modify their theories, which will enable the community of practice to do bigger and better things. And that's called learning or advancing the boundary of knowledge. No?
I think the idea is correct. I'm not sure of exactly how it drives out of this discussion.
Well, it means people have been doing systems thinking for years. Like the principle of hierarchies has been used for thousands of years. People understand the limits of the mind. George, what was it? Miller's rule. Miller stated his rule in the last century, but the military understood that thousands of years ago because they divided everything into tens. And when I looked at that, I sort of wondered, is there a correlation between that and the number of fingers on one hand? Captain Bradley, can the military count more than 10?
Or
So yes,
like
but you try to break the units down into manageable elements that in our system, which should be obvious because the Ukrainians are using our system today, is you want the small units to understand what they have to do and be able to coordinate up the hierarchical levels. Right? But you do prefer small units because they are a good way to get things done.
In management, we call it span of control. It's
Oh,
exactly the same thing.
Yep.
And we've been able to use management by exception to try and increase the span of control, but that has some downsides as well. And so it's going back to the old 10 seems to be much better. And it's worked.
Shall I come in with my question now?
Yes, Pascal.
Yes, Bruce, I've seen that you've addressed 3 types of training. It seems to me that there is a 4th one that might be missing. Over the last 6 years or so, I provide training or capacitation in project management by way of masterclass. I don't teach the fundamentals of system thinking. I teach or I share knowledge on project management with system thinking's input.
Mhm.
So as we progress in discussing project management, from time to time, I pause and bring system thinking or systems engineering input, and I explain why, and I explain how it should be applied and the benefit of that, and we move. So it's system thinking cooked in or injected into another kind of training. You don't seem to have mentioned that. Is there any reason, or is it not something you will encourage?
Well, I think that's true, because I think good thinking is useful everywhere, right? So I guess I'm not sure that it's something to be brought out separately. Yeah, you're sort of talking about a mechanism of injecting the thought process of systems thinking in an application sense.
Yes. The application of system thinking or engineering into something. We discuss it in project management, but tomorrow it could be in accounting, in politics, etc., etc.
Right.
Your
But you're
framework might not
essentially
suit. That's
you're
the thing.
essentially setting up the patterns of thought for those specific instances, rather than the generalization of systems thinking that could then be applied by whoever it is you're interacting with in other places.
Yes,
So
yes,
that
of course.
in some ways that makes you the systems thinker at that point, applying systems thinking to a particular problem and then sharing the problem solution with others.
To a particular class of problems, not a specific problem, but class of problem. Like how
Sure.
do you
Yeah.
apply systems thinking in your scheduling of works?
Mhm.
How do you
Right.
apply that in controlling the works being done, etc., in defining your scope?
See, you
That-
could think of the analogy to mathematics. Mathematics, the way I learned it was pure math and applied math. And so you could think of pure systems thinking and applied systems thinking.
Applied system thinking, yes.
What you're doing, Pascal, is applying systems thinking in project management.
Indeed.
What Bruce was
Indeed.
about was taking a course in pure systems thinking, that is learning the tools themselves, but not necessarily thinking about how to apply them other than the classroom examples.
Well, I would take that
Therefore,
a
we
step
might need
further,
a
Joe.
different framework.
Whoa, let Bruce speak.
I would take that sort of a step further, in that Pascal is actually applying systems thinking to that domain, but he is essentially now limiting the scope of information that needs to be used within that domain, and that is what he's passing along to people in that domain. So it's not that he himself is only applying it. He's actually has probably done the translation of the broader base of systems thinking and limited it to an appropriate scope for the domain.
Yes. I pass on what I deem relevant into that domain.
Yes.
Okay,
Which
Neil,
means somebody doesn't have to know everything about systems thinking to apply it, because you've set up the pattern for application.
yeah, he's teaching applied systems thinking.
Yes.
Okay, Niels.
Yeah.
Whoops.
You go.
Sorry, Niels, I hit the wrong
Yeah.
button.
Thank you. Just as a remark,
Go
my
ahead.
father was teaching also at university in Delft, and they said all students of all engineering areas should learn this. So it was not just one course for one group of students. No, all the students should be taught this stuff, and they called that the Delft approach, because it wasn't common apparently at the other universities.
One aspect you didn't cover, Bruce, was lifelong learning. I had an email from a friend at the Technion in Israel a month ago, And he sent me an email that said he heard that Singapore is getting into lifelong learning, and he wanted to know who I knew in Singapore who was into it and what it was all about.
He left Singapore.
I left Singapore 5 years, so I guess when I left, it stopped. It started up, but it made me think about our learning models. We now have the technology to do things that we couldn't do in the past. And as Gene commented, one of the best ways to learn is to become an apprentice.
Mhm.
In the last 50 years or so, we've gone away from the master apprentice model to the classroom model, which focuses on learning without the experience. Whereas the old master apprentice model mixed learning and experience, but was limited to the knowledge and experience of the particular master. With Zoom and the internet, we can now set up lifelong learning models where experts can be available in places like this or running their own programs for the younger practitioners to start a program of lifelong learning. Any comments from the group?
Can I extend that into just-in-time training?
That's part of, yes. And in fact, that's the best part of it, because I've noticed that when I take a course, because I picked a course for travel. I wanted to go to Los Angeles. I found a course in Los Angeles. And so my company paid. So I went to Los Angeles. I spent the day in the course. I spent the weekend after it sightseeing. Came back and the knowledge was totally forgotten in 2 or 3 weeks because I wasn't using it. So one of the best ways to learn in Bloom's taxonomy kind of stuff is to learn by doing or learn by teaching. So just-in-time training as part of your lifelong learning process is ideal, in my opinion.
And because we use it with the actual work people are doing, they immediately do it and get used to it.
Yes, in my classes, well, in my lifelong learning style classes, I allow the students to do either the exercise I proposed or use the tools on a problem they have at work. And it works out very well. What do other people think about the lifelong learning extension?
So Joe Bradley just put a comment up about the transactional nature of what we're doing in efficiency, and it makes sense that is one of the things that has limited that. It also makes sense that we're not actually training people as well because of it, and that has an impact on your ability to do that lifelong learning or the apprenticeship type program.
So part of my history includes operating an apprentice school. And despite direction from headquarters to terminate the apprentice school. And I discussed this with my civilian leaders and then with the facility commanding officer, and we elected to ignore the direction from headquarters. Turned out to be a particularly wise decision as life played out, but it was based on the headquarters having made a decision about efficiency. And they didn't see the need to have an apprentice program. And in their sense, their actual logic was, because they didn't ever run one, that if we needed one in 5 years or 10 years, we would just go start it up again. And totally ignored all of the knowledge that is inherent in a group that actually does apprentice training as a routine thing. And it's not something you can just turn off and on. It just isn't. And so that's part of that transactional perspective or efficiency perspective, leading people to make really bad long-term decisions in the interest of a short-term goal. And I think that just replicates out throughout many organizations. this, if you've heard the term purple unicorn, it's what companies are looking for today is someone who graduates from college with a particular skill and 15 years of experience. Why? Because they want to pay them their rate for a new college graduate, but they want someone to have 15 years of experience in a particular field. That's a purple unicorn. And so you have this perception out there that no, we as a company don't have to spend and invest in training for our people because of a couple things. That's expensive. And two, what happens if they leave? And what they don't understand is that's the question is, what about your organization is such that they would get that training and leave, right? Instead of staying, right? Because yours is the best place to stay because the training results in performance results in advancement or whatever else the goal is for people. And so you look at people have really subscribed to loops, a lot of the doom loops from Gene's pictures without understanding them. I mean, you can see those archetype, of organization after organization that wants to hire a fresh college graduate with 15 years of experience. And oh, by the way, they also want 4 or 5 certifications, all of which, if you look at them, have some service associated with them, right? So, to get various IT or cyber certifications, you have to have like 4 years or 5 years. I'm a professional engineer. That required at least 4 years of experience to get a PE license from the state of California. You can't find a college graduate with that experience. So you end up with these commonly held beliefs that don't support. And yes, the rates in the service, to answer Gene's question, they are apprentice programs effectively, absolutely. With largely the understanding in the services that it takes between 2 and 4 years to actually get a journeyman, generally closer to 4. And that's a starting journeyman. That's not an experienced journeyman. All right. But it's someone who merits being able to work independently. That's the definition of a journeyman, right? In that kind of background, with only a little bit of supervision. But so you get that, and it's propagated, I believe, largely due to the business literature that focused on efficiency and didn't understand that effectiveness matters more.
I've seen some organizations where they have a designated mentor. They don't actually do that, but he or she is a person that anybody can come to with a problem, and that person will help talk through the problem, understand the situation, and teach the younger engineer with a problem as to how to go about it. And that sort of gives them the best of both worlds.
So I think that's a limited form of mentorship. For me, mentorship really is conveyed by a long-term, in some cases, multi-decadal relationship that spans a generation, right? So I mentor 6 or 7 people that I have actually mentored them for over 10 years. In 3 cases, almost 20 years, right? And so that's more of what I would consider a mentorship relationship, is the long-term work over an extended period of time.
Yeah, I agree. Anyone else want to comment? I'm looking at the clock here.
Yes. I want to go back to your earlier question about lifelong learning. Many years back when I did my MBA, the mantra was learn to act and act to learn. So you go in perpetuity into a lifelong cycle of learning new stuff, applying them, And in applying, you find out needs for more. You push your horizon, then you learn, and then you apply, and you keep going round that wheel or round that spiral. And that's what we learned. And it started at the MBA school. And I suspect we carried it on after the MBA school, possibly today.
Well,
It's just something to consider. Yes?
some of the professional societies now require you to recertify every so often. And every year you need a number of PDUs, professional development units, which means
Yes.
you've read something, you've attended a course. I'm not sure how practical that is, especially when they tell me, I get an email from them that says, we're trying something new. Would you comment on this and we'll give you 2 PDUs credit for doing so?
Yeah, the idea is good, but I think the administration has become a tick box exercise. People go to training, they drink coffee, and then they get an attendance certificates, and they pile up those certificates to go through the next cycle of certification. The
Right.
learning per se does not happen.
I've got a box of those certificates to show I attended courses, but it says
Yes.
nothing about the outcome.
Exactly. It should have been a way of measuring a delta or an increment in learning and an increment in the ability to practice competency.
You're right. That's why I don't wear earphones. My head is not so full of knowledge that I need the earphones to stop it falling out of my ears. I think I used that one the other day, so
Yeah.
apologize.
Well, some of us use it to just not lose what we already have.
See, there's an assumption there, Bruce, that there's something in there.
Well, what about those who wear glasses, like yourself?
What about it?
What are they trying to keep inside?
I have no idea, but there are no holes in there are holes in the ears. Okay, it's degenerated like my classes after 2 hours. We get to the point. It's time to end the session. So thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you everybody for attending, and we'll be back on the hour for the last session.